Thank you so much, Manisha, for having me today. I really wanted to have relevant education for my children. I wanted them to be really cultured and have seen most of the world. It was something that was really important to me. And so we started on our journey to world school and see different parts of the planet.
That is truly incredible, Shireen. Can you tell us about some of the amazing adventures you went on as a family?
Yes, so we started off, actually, we were outside of Amsterdam. I taught at an international school. My husband has been an incredible stay-at-home dad slash teacher. And so we started in Amsterdam, moved to Portugal. We were in Mexico City for about 3 years, and then we needed to move to the U.S. We came back to the U.S. because my oldest daughter is deaf and hard of hearing. And later we found out, and we know that she is autistic as well. We weren't receiving the services we needed abroad. And so because I know how to work the U.S. system, we came back here.
Having taught in both public and private schools in the US and abroad, what do you see as some of the fundamental problems with traditional schooling?
Well, I think that the education system as we know it right now is not preparing our students for a world that is fast approaching and that we're actually in. I think we are teaching to an industrial era that doesn't exist in the same way anymore. I think having the bells and sitting in rows and taking attendance and being tardy or truant and penalties in this way just isn't relevant for where we're moving. You know, a lot of my students are cycle breakers, and so they're having to move out of the industrial and into the future fields.
Did you feel like this was also the case in the international school you taught at in Amsterdam?
So I think that, it's interesting because there were a lot of things that I learned working at the international schools, which was really being able to serve students, that my position was to be of service, which was fantastic. Moving forward with Colossal, that I'm a conduit for their success and not the all-knowing person. The other thing that I will say, though, is that they still followed a very tight schedule, high rigor, oftentimes lots of competition, really competitive, and that's just not how things are going to be working in the future. It's a lot more collaborative in nature.
What do you think is driving this need for high rigor and tight schedule when everything is telling us that what children need is entrepreneurial skills, flexibility, and the research really shows that this stressful environment isn't conducive to their learning? Is it fear?
That's a great question. I think with the international and the very prestigious schools, they're interested in maintaining an insular environment. So they really, more than anything, it's not that their academics are any better. It's really that they do not need to mix with the regular population. And how they do that is through making sure that students are on top of performance. I think their matrices of evaluating and their matrix of success are outdated, but I really think that these schools are really to maintain the rich and the elite, stay with the rich and the elite.
Back to your decision to homeschool and world school. Did you have an aha moment where you decided, I'm out, I'm not doing traditional schools anymore, we're going to homeschool?
Yeah, my journey was pretty interesting. I started in the public. It wasn't quite right for a lot of violence that I was subjected to being in the public school. International wasn't right because it didn't have a mix of socioeconomics. Montessori wasn't right because I didn't feel like they had enough rigor. It was kind of like what Carrie McDonald would call it, the Goldilocks effects. So I thought, okay, somehow I will blend all of these components into one. And that's kind of the genesis of wanting to homeschool in the way that I know would work for my students, my children, excuse me. And, one of the, one of the parents in our community calls it gourmet learning, which I think is brilliant. Though it was my teen, her IEP was shifted. She's deaf and hard of hearing and autistic. They shifted her IEP to put her in general ed in middle school. And what that looked like was a lot of bullying. There were these girls that were, videotaping her in the locker room and putting her in a very vulnerable and dangerous situation. So I said, no more.
I love the term gourmet learning. I once heard a homeschooling expert say, you can go to any restaurant of any nationality, anywhere you are in the US, but when you're picking schools, it's all the same. It's a really great analogy. I'm so sorry to hear that your teen went through that. That's so incredibly painful to see your child suffering in that way. I also think it's interesting that you weren't able to get special services in Mexico, but then you returned to the States and were able to benefit from some of the special services that school offered without actually sending your daughter to school, which was really innovative and creative.
Yeah, so, I happen to be very lucky. I'm in the state of Florida. We are able to participate in Family Empowerment Scholarship for students with special needs. And so she was awarded money so that I could start to really tailor her education by having tutors when I needed, but also therapies and adaptive resources that I needed for her. Val, I would love to hear your opinions and thoughts on homeschooling. It's definitely been a journey in and out of homeschooling and really doing gourmet learning with our family. So I'd love to hear what your opinions and your thoughts, especially for moving past 2036, as our kindergartners this year will be graduating in 2036.
Here are my latest thoughts on an ideal education system. Every family is given an allowance for their child's education to spend on classes, curriculum, experiences, and childcare. In this system, what accountability is there? If any, is accountability via the service provider, or is it in some student tracking system? Is the child thriving socially, emotionally, or academically? Or is it some combination of both on the service providers and tracking the student? Is the purpose of education to serve the child, or is part of the role of education to uphold democratic values? Is education there to serve the community and democracy too? Is it a fiber that holds us together? Does that matter? And also, do most parents care enough to put intention into educational choices? And how do we keep track of those children who might be neglected? Anyone who wants to respond, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Whoa, that is a really big bite. I'm going to take a tiny nibble off of that. I really believe firmly that the classroom is an agent of change and that what you see in society is reflected deeply into the classroom. And that if we remain micro, we can really start to dive into some of these harder, difficult topics. I do fear, however, that not everybody's primary value is in education, and that making sweeping legislation or sweeping decisions based on families' choices is actually going to create families who put education first. I don't know that that is the truth. I do, however, want to point to a little bit more division between what is at-home parenting and what is the role of education in the education system. In the U.S., we do take on more responsibilities than I believe we should be, and that includes making sure that no child is neglected, every child is fed. We just keep piling on top of teachers and educators more responsibilities. The last thing I do want to point to is I'm nervous that some of our undocumented children will be lost in the cracks of reform that includes like vouchers for every child, right? Right now, we're seeing in Florida that you have to have a social security number in order to apply for the ESA, and that does leave out families.
I have opinions and I have thoughts. I'm not sure they're all that valid because I don't personally invest that much time into it. I do some home lessons with the kids myself. But largely I would say that they're more unschooled than homeschooled. Homeschooling requires a lot of effort, a lot of work, a lot of resources, a lot of support. And frankly, it's not easy at all. So I would say for the most part, I've just punted. Everyone has different opinions and agendas. And I think parents should be able to raise their kids mostly however they want. It's not really about a duty to society because that can become fought over and become a form of coercion. Like, should they be raised Christian or atheist? Do they need to know math or science or literature and who's science and so on? So it's better just to let the parents, I think, do it, assuming the parents are attentive and care, which is a big assumption. But within those boundaries, what I care about is kids learning foundations of numeracy and literacy. And then everything else is more up to them and driven by their interest. I do think that the majority of industrial schooling and the industrial education system is designed as a combination of daycare and employability and keeping kids off the streets, and much less about education. Real education, I don't think is really possible unless the kid wants to learn. What each kid wants to learn, what level they're at, is highly individualistic. So Brett Hall was saying in another room that like tutoring, one-to-one tutoring is the way to go. And to me, homeschooling is just parents essentially taking responsibility for one-to-one tutoring for their child and then not wasting the child's time, letting them have the same freedom that you would have wanted as an adult. After all, I'll bet you don't remember 95% of what you learned in school. And yes, maybe it was absorbed in some deep way and sank into your bones, but I doubt it. A lot of that stuff just gets forgotten. The real things you remember are the things that you were interested in. That said, if a child shows an interest or an aptitude early on in math or music or reading or writing, you kind of want to let them indulge in that early on and not have to have them spend times on things that they might not care about, like geography and history. You can learn that stuff later. A lot of that stuff can be done by looking up things or by AI or calculators and so on. So especially given the tools that we have today, it probably makes more sense to allow a child to indulge in whatever they're actually into, whether it's Minecraft or Legos or robotics or creative writing or storytelling or poetry or singing, than it is to try and force them into something that they don't want to learn otherwise. But you can give them efficient foundations like basic arithmetic, which is kind of all you need in math for most professions or skills or careers, and basic literacy, which is kind of all you need for the ability to then learn most things. If you can kind of lay those foundations out, then I think the rest should just be driven by the child and their specific needs, and the parents are playing the role of one-on-one tutor as needed. But I would say homeschooling is still very, very hard. It would be great to have, automatic lesson plans and curricula and materials, and frankly, something that can compete with games. The games out there are so good now. The cheap dopamine addictions are so good. How do you raise kids in an environment where they have the iPad and they have unlimited YouTube videos, and TikTok and, for teenagers and Snapchat? And how do you compete against legal marijuana? How are you going to incent your kids to get off the couch in that kind of an environment? So I think, contraception, so you have a lot of teenage sex going on. How do you compete with that? How do you create an environment where there's any room for anything else other than pure indulgence? And I think the most overrated objection to homeschooling is, what about socialization? In my experience, people are over-socialized these days, not under-socialized. There's so many avenues to socialize. And a lot of the misery and depression and suicide comes about because of social games that people are playing. Look at people who are on Instagram or TikTok all the time. They're over-socialized. Are they happier for it? I saw a study a while back that said that homeschool kids were 1 to 2 years ahead of private school kids. Private school kids were a year or so ahead of public school kids. But unschooled kids, kids who had received no schooling whatsoever and spent their day however they wanted, were only about a year behind. This was at the college level. And once they were in college, the unschooled kids caught up very quickly within a year or two. So essentially, not schooling at all only sets you behind for a year until you care to catch up. And that indicates to me that it's learning that drives teaching, not teaching that drives learning.
Well, Naval, I think that you've definitely hit the nail on the head with that one. I think that students and children have to be in a space that's safe for them to learn and to explore. The space that we've created is really about unschooling a lot. A lot of my students come from industrial school and into a more open environment. I find that they actually need a lot more time in nature, and that is a consistent way to get them off the screens and reconnect with themselves in nature and each other in nature. I think that is a huge component that is missing in our society, definitely in our education system, and that there's plenty of time and space within the homeschooling spheres to do that. The other thing I think that's really important is for young people to have the opportunity to be entrepreneurs and to explore the entrepreneurial way. There is nothing more challenging than being an entrepreneur, and essentially, all of the headspace that goes with being an entrepreneur and all of the mind undoing that we have to do to coach ourselves to continue. But furthermore, it's really making everything relevant for young people so that they understand why they're building a website or why they're learning numbers and numeracy and why these things are relevant and practical. And hopefully then they have their own business, right, that they can capitalize on. And my hope is that young people then contribute in ways that solve problems in their communities.
I absolutely agree on entrepreneurship. In fact, people spend so much time going to business school and business classes when really running even a small company will teach you everything or nearly everything you need to know about business far better than any business school or business class would.